The town of the Old West seemed to have no hurry, as if time dragged along, resonating in the dusty streets. The dust, kicked up by the hooves of horses, was the only constant, floating in the air and covering everything with a thin, suffocating layer. The wooden buildings, simple and worn, were like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit but still formed the setting of a place that survived by routine and a lack of urgency. The people, all with hardened looks from the relentless heat and hard life, walked either hurriedly or sluggishly, always with a destination in mind but never straying from their path. At the heart of it all, the bank was more than just a building. It was the backbone of the town, a sturdy structure, built with solid bricks and imposing wood. It stood as the guardian of the town's wealth, a place where business and promises were made with handshakes and nothing more. The bank, with its large clock on the facade, symbolized the balance between the few local fortunes and the daily struggle for survival. It was also the only place where financial decisions were made, and where most of the population depended on mutual trust, something fragile and vulnerable in a world as unpredictable as the Old West. It was here that many important lives crossed paths. The banker, a man with a respectable appearance, who always had a kind word for every customer and a courteous smile for visitors, seemed to be the pillar of the town. But inside, there was something much more complex. The banker, with his impeccable posture, seemed to embody security, but his life was far from as clean and straightforward as he made it appear. He knew that in a place like this, where distrust and greed were common, appearances were everything. Meanwhile, the sheriff, known for his firmness and rigid stance, walked the town with the impassive face of one who had seen it all. His penetrating gaze examined every movement, every small detail around him, as if he were waiting for the right moment to act. With a long history of being the arm of the law, he believed that nothing would escape his control. But deep down, he also knew that the town was about to be shaken by something he couldn't control, something that would change everything forever. The plan was being forged in the shadows, far from the curious eyes of the town. The outlaws were not like those who stormed banks with gunfire and violence. No, this group had a more clever and strategic approach, led by a man with a murky past. They knew that the Old West was not a place of easy heroism, but of ingenuity and manipulation. Every move was calculated, and each member of the group had a unique skill that made them indispensable to the success of the plan. It wasn't just about stealing the money. They wanted something more, something even more valuable: control over the town and its essence. The mastermind behind the plan, a cold and calculating leader, knew that the key lay in controlled chaos. He didn't need firearms or violence, but distraction. Inside the bank, the setting was perfect for this. With its narrow hallways and constant movement of people, the bank was a tiny cave of trust. The idea was simple but incredibly effective. Use distraction to create a gap in the defenses and then exploit the panic that would follow. It was a psychological game where every step taken was a calculated provocation, a piece placed on the town's chessboard. But the plan didn't rely solely on the outlaws. The banker, with his facade of an honest man, had more at stake than anyone realized. He wasn't just a passive observer, but an active player with his own secret interests and alliances. He had reasons to cooperate, and those reasons were deeply rooted in the complex power exchanges that shaped the town's fate. The banker knew that by giving the next move to the outlaws, he would be playing his final card, one that could change the course of the town forever. Meanwhile, the sheriff, though always vigilant, was unaware of the plan's details. He believed he knew the town like the back of his hand, but little did he know that the real threat didn't come from the outside, but from within, and his own beliefs were about to be challenged. He was starting to realize that in a world of lies and secrets, nothing was what it seemed. What he didn't know was that he too would be a pawn in the outlaws' game, though he still didn't know which side he was meant to choose. The day of the heist arrived quietly, like the calm before the storm. In the old west town, everything seemed in place, routine, as if nothing were different. Horses trotted down the streets, merchants opened their shops, and the sound of the wind was the only companion to the wooden walls of the bank. Inside the bank, the movement was normal, unhurried, with no signs of alarm. Yet something was about to break that tranquility, and no one knew. The outlaws, now inside the bank, began moving almost imperceptibly, spreading out across the service area. The leader was calm, almost serene, as if he knew exactly what to do with every step. No firearms were drawn, there were no shouts or physical intimidation. Instead, there was a thick atmosphere of psychological control. A simple movement of the eye, an exchange of seemingly innocent words, but carefully chosen. Distraction was the first step to the success of the plan, and gradually, people began to lose themselves in a state of uncertainty. Meanwhile, the banker watched it all, with a soft smile on his face. He seemed to be in total control of the situation, but his expression concealed an internal dilemma. What seemed like a situation of rising panic was, to him, a game of patience. He knew that behind the facade of a heist was something much bigger, a scheme he himself had fueled. His involvement in the game was beginning to become evident to the more observant, but no one yet knew how far he would go to ensure his own survival. The sheriff, who was outside the bank, noticed that something was wrong. Something in the air had changed. The sound of the town, once full of life, now seemed muffled, as if the town itself was holding its breath. He felt a wave of discomfort, something that made him quicken his steps. But when he arrived at the bank, what he found was far more complex than he could have imagined. The heist was underway, but not in the way he expected. He couldn't just solve it with his typical straightforward approach. There in the bank, the game didn't involve just pistols, but sharp minds and nerves of steel. As the tension in the bank reached its peak, the sheriff found himself facing an impossible choice. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't fully grasp the complexity of the situation. The bank, once just a common place for transactions, was now becoming the center of a psychological game where he was a piece, not the player. He didn't have all the answers, but his intuition told him that the key was in realizing that this heist wasn't about the money. It was something deeper, something unfolding beneath the surface. The turning point came when, in the midst of the chaos, the sheriff locked eyes with the banker. For a moment it seemed as though time stopped. The banker's expression, once calm, now showed something different. Regret? A silent confession? The sheriff, still unsure of the full extent of what was happening, was struck by a feeling that the banker knew more than he should. Right then, the sheriff realized that he had perhaps underestimated the pieces of this game. He wasn't just dealing with outlaws. He was facing a much more complex system where everyone, even him, was being manipulated. Meanwhile, the outlaws began moving toward the vault. The operation was nearly complete. The tension increased, and the feeling that something catastrophic was about to happen filled the air. But it was precisely at this moment, when the plan seemed on the verge of success, that the real turning point occurred. The leader of the outlaws, who had been so confident, made a critical mistake. He underestimated the sheriff's cunning. Instead of acting with brute force, the sheriff began playing the same game of deception and manipulation the outlaws had used to create confusion. It was then that the sheriff made his strategic move. He took advantage of the distraction to plant doubt in the minds of the outlaws. He knew that if he could break their trust in each other, the whole plan would fall apart. The tension was palpable as the leader of the outlaws hesitated for a brief moment, suspicious of his own men's loyalty. And so, with a calculated move, the sheriff turned the tables. He had become the unlikely hero, not by being the strongest or the fastest, but by being the most astute. The bank's clock seemed unwilling to move. Each passing second grew heavier than the last, as if time itself were stretching, anticipating the impending catastrophe. The leader of the outlaws, now suspicious and uneasy, began to realize that the game was changing. The plan, so meticulously orchestrated up until that point, was about to collapse before his eyes. The tension between the members of the group became visible, with furtive glances and hesitant movements. Something was wrong, and the leader knew it. The sheriff, in turn, felt that this was the decisive moment. With a firm and calculated look, he moved forward with the strategy he had been devising since the beginning. In a quick and precise move, he used the distraction of the outlaws to ensure that the chaos was amplified, but this time he wouldn't be the target. He positioned himself so that all eyes were on him, creating a new breach in the outlaws' defense. The plan now was simple. Make the outlaws lose trust in each other, thus making them vulnerable. Inside the bank, the atmosphere was tense. The employees, now aware that something much bigger was at play, remained silent, watching it all with their hearts racing. The banker, with a tense expression, was in a personal dilemma, watching the situation slip out of his control. He had nurtured the idea that everything would go as planned, but now he began to realize that the betrayal he had helped create could destroy everything he had built. His empire was about to crumble before his eyes. The final turn came when the sheriff, using the confusion generated by the distrust among the outlaws, made his decisive move. He approached the leader quickly, not with weapons, but with sharp words that dismantled the control the criminal had over the group. The leader of the outlaws, completely disoriented, failed to realize that his trust had been undermined from the very beginning. It was at this moment that the sheriff delivered the final blow, turning the game around and ensuring that the Old West town had a chance to remain intact. With the outlaws' plan in ruins, the chaos inside the bank intensified. The leader of the outlaws, now completely disoriented, tried to reorganize his crew, but the trust between them had shattered. The disorder among the criminals became evident, and the tension in the air was palpable. The sheriff, calm as someone who had seen many dangerous situations, knew it wasn't over yet. The crucial moment had arrived, and he needed to act quickly. The banker, now exposed as a central piece in the outlaws' plan, found himself cornered. His facade of a respectable and trustworthy man had crumbled, and he had to make an impossible decision. His alliance with the outlaws placed him in a vulnerable position, but he knew that if he didn't do what was necessary to save himself, he would lose everything. He looked at the sheriff, knowing that his next action could mean the difference between freedom and an irreversible fall. The truth, which had until now been hidden behind curtains of lies and manipulation, was about to be revealed. The sheriff then made the final decision. He knew that the bank was not just a place for financial transactions. It was the center of the town's power, and with it, the control over everyone's fate. In a calculated move, he used the outlaws' flaws to make the decisive play, disarming them both physically and psychologically. At the same time, he forced the banker to stand before the town, revealing his true face and facing the consequences of his actions. In the end, the sheriff didn't emerge as the traditional hero everyone had expected. He didn't need brute force or violence to restore order. His true victory was in the clever way he maneuvered the pieces of the game, exposing the lies and manipulating the events to his advantage. The town, though devastated by the truth that had just been revealed, began to rebuild, with the trust of the population being tested in ways they had never imagined. The sheriff, now aware that the Old West was a place where appearances were everything, began to question whether true justice would always be an illusion. The town of the Old West would never be the same again. The bank heist, which had started as a simple robbery, ended up revealing far more than just the behavior of a group of outlaws. It was the turning point for the entire community, which now found itself in the midst of a deep crisis of trust. The citizens who had once viewed the bank as a pillar of stability now questioned everything they knew about their town, their leaders, and even their own beliefs. The lie had been exposed, and the consequences were deeper than anyone could have imagined. The sheriff, who had initially seemed to be just another character in an old Western tale, now became a more complex and introspective figure. He knew that, despite restoring order, he himself had been changed by everything that had happened. The line between right and wrong had become blurred, and he found himself torn between upholding the law and the need to administer justice in a more personal, truer way. He looked at the town and realized that it would no longer be possible to return to the tranquility that had existed before. The bank heist had not just been an external threat, but an internal rupture in the very essence of the town. The banker, for his part, faced the repercussions of his choices. His image as an honest, trustworthy man was destroyed, and now he would have to deal with the consequences of his alliance with the outlaws. He knew that the trust of his clients and the community would never be restored. More than the money, he had lost something much more valuable: his credibility. But in a world where survival is the priority, he wondered how far his manipulation could go to ensure his position. His future, like that of the town, seemed uncertain and unstable. Town was in ruins, but perhaps that was the only way to rebuild it. The heist had revealed the flaws in the system and exposed the uncomfortable truth that had been hidden beneath the surface. The Old West, with its bravery and its lies, had been forged on an unstable foundation. Now the people would have to choose: rebuild on the ruins of broken trust, or try to move forward carrying the scars of a past marked by betrayal. What had seemed like a crime story in the end became a story of redemption and reconfiguration. As the town began to reorganize itself, the scars of the heist continued to haunt its inhabitants. The sheriff, now more introspective, knew that the real fight was yet to come. The game of manipulation and deceit, which had started with a simple robbery, left traces that would affect the future of everyone. The Old West, with its promises of freedom and justice, seemed to have been swallowed by a darker, more complex reality. And although the words of restoring order had been spoken, the sheriff felt that the town was still not ready to face the truth that had been exposed. No matter how hard the town tried to move forward, the internal divisions and doubts could not be easily erased. The banker, in his fall from a position of respect, began to see the world around him crumble. His allies, those he had manipulated and controlled over the years, started to distance themselves, aware of the dirty game he had played. But there was still something in the depths of his eyes, a spark of desperation, as if he knew he could not escape his actions. His future was as uncertain as the fate of the town itself. Meanwhile, the sheriff, despite his victory, found no peace. He knew that although he had stopped the robbery, the greatest theft had been the trust of the people. And no matter how much he had fulfilled his role, he wondered how far the truth could be manipulated before everything fell apart. The town was full of unresolved secrets, and the sheriff didn't know if he was ready to confront them. Deep down, he too carried his own shadows, unresolved issues that haunted him, and somehow intertwined with the story of the bank and its characters. The heist hadn't ended for anyone. Even months later, the echoes of that day still resounded in the bank's hallways and in the minds of the inhabitants. The Old West, with its relentless pursuit of justice and honor, was about to learn that sometimes the greatest betrayals happen within one's own house, and those who believe themselves to be above everything will, sooner or later, face the consequences of their own mistakes. The mystery that began with a simple bank robbery still hung in the air, and no one knew when it would be fully revealed. After all, in a land of lies and distrust, not everything can be resolved with a simple victory.